So this is what I had to rig up to get that bearing out. It's an inside out type puller. It goes down inside the bearing, and when you screw in the thing, it flares out and catches the lip of the bearing. I had this long bowl. I had to build it up the way I can reach in there and keep this from turning with a crescent wrench, and turn that with a crescent wrench, and you can see it pop free. But I also stuck a torch down in there after I got all this hooked up and heated up the aluminum a little bit, and it's coming out pretty good. Hopefully it doesn't damage the bearing. Okay, I just added this spacer in here so I can crank her up a little further. The threads in the end of that puller down there aren't long enough to do it all in one step. Here's the bearing. Hopefully it didn't damage the bearing, because I'm kind of hoping to reuse it. Okay, I got the bearing out of that hole, and I put it in a little container with some clean gas and shook it around for a while. Because after I pulled it out, I put it on the end there and rotated. It felt kind of rough, like a piece of debris had got in it. So I took it out and I put it in a plastic container and I shook it with gas and dipped it around, and then I blew it out with air and put some oil on it and put it back on that shaft, and it spun really smooth. So I'm good to go. I put a new bearing in there. That was a BTM2520A. I don't know if they're available. Okay, that's the bearing for the aft end of the counter idler shaft. And it's a HK2520 bearing, and I kind of gently tapped it until I got it barely started. Put a little moly lube in there, just a light dusting of it, and then using this to press it home. I warmed up the aluminum with my propane torch. That bearing goes with the number side down. The shield goes. It has these little screws. Got some gear oil here and lube up that bearing. After that bearing is installed and you get the this part of the transmission put together, you can take this plug off and pour some gear oil down in there, and that'll really lubricate the hell out of that bearing. Transmission kit from Pro King didn't come with this bearing. This kit is BK224WS. WS means with synchros. I had all the bearings, main bearings for the transmission. It didn't have the needle bearings that are underneath a lot of the gears, but it had the main bearings except for that one, which is 28NQ4020NRD, and it is a KOYO bearing from Japan. Anyway, it drops in this hole here. This thing goes over it, holds it in place with 2 bolts. Usually this bearing slides in pretty easy, but for some reason this one's not, so I'm just going to warm this up a little bit. Now with it warmed up, it just pops right in there, no problem at all. sure you clean out your socket while you're putting things together. I'm sure nothing falls, any debris falls out of there. You just rub it around like that and then wrap it on something a couple times. Usually works pretty good. Of course, I'm using 12 millimeter. Tighten that down. I'm going to glue the gasket on this. And before we can bolt, when we bolt this thing on, keep some 1.5 inch. These are 10 millimeter by 1.25, about 1.5 inch long. And there's some of these holes on the intermediate plate are threaded, so we can glue the gasket and install this, and these bolts will be on there temporarily. I'll kind of go into that a little more later on. I'll put a thin layer of gasket compound. I guess if a guy wants to have too much of this, it's better to have too much on the bottom than it is on the top part. Probably less likely to leak, but you don't want to overdo it for squeeze out, because it'll squeeze the stuff out inside the transmission. Try to keep that to a minimum. Now I'm going to prep the intermediate plate over here, goop it up the same way so we can put it on. And ready to put this on. A little prep work. I goop this up with non-hardening gasket sealant.
The president called the sinking mass murder. The Marine controller told the captain to get the passengers on being expressed in caucus and around the cabinet table. Susan Munn has more.
Sure, the 3 shift shafts go in first. Sliding in there real nice and easy. Now this bearing is usually what holds it up. I'm going in any further, so. Oh, I got lucky. It went right in there. Now these bolts, this is threaded in here for these oversized bolts. The bolts that actually go in here when you bolt it to the car are smaller. This is temporary, so when we bolt this to the bell housing, we'll put in the empty spots, we'll put bolts in, and we'll leave these alone until after we've got some bolts in. Then we'll take these out and put the 12 millimeter head bolts in there. These have 14 millimeter heads. Put a few of them in. And I'll hold the gasket nice and tight up against there. Okay, the bolts I put in, there's 2 here, 2 here, 1 on the bottom left, and 1 on the center left. Those are the only ones that are threaded. These are two need to be about 1.5 inches long. The others only need to be about 1.25 inches long. And that'll hold this together until we get it attached to the bell housing. And we'll put the bolts in that are open, and then we'll take those out. That way this keeps the gasket tight and lets the gasket compound seal up while we're still finishing up the transmission. The first things that has to be installed is the C-clip for this bearing. So I'm just going to tap the shaft until that's out far enough where I can get the ring that goes on here. The thickness of it is 0.042 inches. You usually get this is where the crack gap is right here. And get it started on there. And just kind of push it on all the way around until it snaps into place. And then you push the shaft back and you're good to go. So all that's left to do is to put two C-clips here, and we'll put the dogs on. Okay, these ball bearings are 0.312 diameter. Goes inside there. The spring follows. The size of the spring is about 0.821 long, 0.31 diameter. And then these plugs, they have a 6mm Allen. I like to goop them up with some non-hardening gasket compound, the threads a little bit, just to make sure they don't leak.
Just for fun. But I realized as I've been going through this exercise of trying to describe the meaning of there, and I'm reluctant to say this, but we missed a bunch.
I usually give them a wrap.
That is your thing.
Sure, snug.
CBCR2 Shift on Twitter and on Facebook.
When we bought our house, we cut some corners and didn't hire a realtor. I guess we might want to do a little fish canning.
A C-clip goes on this
You can get used to the smell of squid.
shaft. And push on with very carefully with a pair of needle nose pliers.
Neighborhood to closing for the right price. A realtor is your best ally. Visit realtor.ca
Get started.
for more.
This message is brought to you by
Push on
Real Estate
till it
Association.
snaps on.
To support your local realtor.
When planning Northern Gateway's marine operations, we set out to make BC's North.
Okay, now we're ready for the
for all vessels.
dogs. Or the second dog is yellow usually, and this part goes up, the flat side down, tapered side on top. So we'll just tap it in. Notice I was supporting the shaft over here. The upper one is usually white, painted white, and the dogs are down. I'll put this one on next, but check it before you put it on. Make sure this isn't stuck. You want it's a spring in there, and you want it to be flexible going up and down. Using the channel locks, you don't have to pound it. Kind of like doing it that way. Okay, got the 3 dogs on. I rotate the shaft around so that 2 hole or these little drilled spots here for the ball bearings are on top. I put a little dab of grease on those holes. Kind of roll the bearing around until it's shielded in there. And you got to put the Speedo on first. There's a notch in here. Gears go back aft. Slide that over and lock it over the bearing. Now I can put that in. And then this ring right here goes, it's got a notch in it for the bearing. It goes over that. But before we put that on, we got to put a snap ring here and a snap ring here. 0.11 thick snap ring. You got to watch out for this one because sometimes it needs to be a little thinner. I'm assuming this one's 0.11 because that's all I've got here. But after I install it, get some more gears on, I might have trouble getting the very last snap ring on. This last snap ring down here on the end. And I might end up pulling all this back apart, put a thinner one in there. But since that's the only one I have here, I assume that's the one that came out of there. Alright. Now we've got everything together. Just got to put a gasket on here, and then this housing will go on next. As I explained earlier, I had this tied in so that shaft couldn't move while we were sliding this case on, because otherwise it'll push it forward and it'll knock this thing in here out of position. So just make sure it's centered in there. I usually shine a flashlight in there and make sure that there's sticking down there. And this reverse pin goes in between those 19mm bolt. Okay, just to play it safe, I installed these and I put this C-clip on just to make sure it was going to fit in there and not be too tight, because since I didn't take this transmission apart, I wasn't sure that these two snap rings back here, they're both 0.11 thick. In my experience, usually one's a little thinner than the other, and I've had trouble getting this snap ring on some if I put too thick of a snap ring. So it's the it's the second snap ring that we're concerned about, the one that's right in front of the spacer. Okay, the next step would be to install these two bearings. These are what are called open cage needle bearings. So we've got the dogs, 3 dogs installed, white, yellow, and no color. 2 C-clips. The ball bearings that go under here with the spring and the plug, ball bearing spring plug, ball bearing spring plug. We've got our snap ring on this bearing. We've got this retainer plate with 2 bolts underneath holding it, and we have the snap ring for this bearing on. And then the Speedo, and there's a ball bearing underneath it. 2 snap rings are the one closer to the Speedo is 0.11 thickness. This one over here is also 0.11 on this vehicle. Sometimes they're a little thinner. Spacer, 2 bearings. Now the transfer case housing is ready to go on.